Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Rossy Rivera and today we're going to be decorating a mug with Wednesday Addams. I hope you like the project. Let's get started. As usual, we have a printable PDF pattern available and we are going to cut out these pieces from the main template. So the face, the collar for her blouse, the dress, neck and shoulders, and the two hair pieces. Again, you can find this on our website. It's also linked in the description box below. Now for the neck and shoulders, we're gonna need 2 tablespoons of a peach color, and we are going to stretch that out until we can fit in the cutout for the neck and shoulders. And now we're just going to cut around our cutout. And as you notice, I'm doing this in one single line. And this is just to make sure it's as smooth as possible and as close to the cutout as possible. And once we're done, it's gonna look like this. Now we're just going to smooth down the edges using Vaseline. We're just not gonna do that at the bottom since that part is gonna be on the edge of the mug. I'm being mostly careful with her neck since it's going to be very visible. And now we're going to start adding the details with a rubber brush. Now we're going to lift this and place it directly on our mug. The important thing is to make sure it's well centered, using the base of the mug as a reference. Of course, you can put this on any shape of mug. This case, it's kind of square, but it works just the same with a round mug, a mason jar, or even just a glass. I'm just making sure it's even all around, pressing down on it a bit, and then making that slant cut at the top of her neck since we're going to need some space for the head. And now we're going to add some shading around her neck since it's the only side that's going to be really visible. I'm going to get this orange eyeshadow and adding it to that edge right there, and then the same to the other edge, especially where it's closer to the mug to give it that sense of depth. And then just a bit at the top of her neck and on that little indent we made earlier. Now we're going to continue with her dress. For this part of the dress, we're going to need 2 tablespoons of black clay, black cold porcelain clay, just so it's a little bit thicker. And we're going to stretch that out until we can fit that piece in. Once that's ready, we're going to do the same thing we did for the neck and shoulders and cut out using the cutout we got from the printable. Now again, these edges are going to look sort of like cookie cutter, like we use a cookie cutter, so they're going to be very sharp. So I'm using Vaseline to smooth them down, except for the bottom again, since it's on the edge of the mug. Once we're done, it's going to look like this. And now we're going to place it over the bottom part of the piece we had before, so over the shoulders. And again, we're using that bottom of the mug as a reference on where to put our layer pieces. Now we're going to be stretching these top piece around just so we can try to cover the piece we have underneath. And we're going to do the same thing towards the bottom. I'm a little bit off frame here, but I think you get the general idea of just trying to cover that skin color with the dress clay. We're basically just dressing her up. Okay, you can see it a bit better here. And then I'm cutting off the excess to make sure it's always even or flat at the bottom. And I'm just adding some pressure on it against the table, and again cutting off the excess so it doesn't affect the level of the mug. So making sure that's well attached to the base, the skin base. All around. Now we're going to add the pattern or design on her dress. And for that, we are going to need a little bit of white acrylic paint. But we need it to be watered down, so I'm going to add a little bit of water from my spray bottle. Just before we do that, we're going to add the lines for where her arms roughly are. In my case, this is 1.5 centimeters. I'm just measuring that on both sides to make sure they're even, and we're going to add some details later. This is just a reference to make sure where we're going to limit or finish our painting. So notice I'm mixing the paint on the side. Had a little accident there, but it works just fine. I'm getting more white if I need to. And then slowly we're going to make those patterns. And the figures or the design on her dress is basically just a circle with an X underneath. To me, they look sort of like little guys, little figures, like stick figures. If you notice, I always get a reference image. Just to make sure I'm getting this as close as possible. So when I'm trying to design or recreate a character, I try to get as many images as I can to sort of get the general idea of the character. And if you notice, I'm using that, like her neckline, the color for her dress, as a reference to make sure I don't waste paint and work. So I don't really need to add the pattern underneath the color. So I'm going to focus all around that area instead. Slowly adding those little guys until we've done that to her entire dress. And now we're going to make her arms / shoulders. And that's going to be 1 teaspoon of clay for each arm / shoulder. And if you notice, I'm just kneading that into a ball, making this sort of drop shape. It doesn't need to be too long, but I did flatten it down, and at the top, again, a little bit off frame here. But I was just adding some indents to make it look like she has puff sleeves around the shoulder area. And now I'm just gonna place that back onto our design on the mug. And I'm again off camera, sorry about that, but I'm just cutting off the excess. Here you go. And there we go. So I'm just making an indent at the top of that, like that space between her shoulder and her neck, to give a better idea of like the shape. And I just did that on the same thing on the other shoulder. And now we're gonna make that same design from the dress, that same pattern, all over the arm. Luckily, if you don't like it, just gotta like smudge it out, maybe add a little bit of water, just a little bit, and then just do it again. There we go. And again, just doing this all around. Trying to be careful so the paint isn't too watered down, so the circle doesn't like turn into a solid circle. We want to keep that outline. And once that's done, once we've done this all around, it's gonna look like this. And making sure we get down to the edges where the clay meets the mug. Now we're actually gonna get down to that dress color, and we're getting half a tablespoon of white clay. And using the cutout again from our printable. And now getting Vaseline to smooth down the edges. Doing that all around. And once we're done with that, we can put it and layer it again on our main clay, or clay base, you could call it. And in this case, I'm gonna add a little bit of glue just to make sure it stays in place. So I just want to make sure that looks like it's actually 3D, so it's coming from the back of our dress as well. And this one turned out a bit longer, so we can either just adjust it to the bottom of the mug, or maybe cut off the excess, so whichever you prefer. And now we're going to continue with her face. But before we do that, again, I'm a bit off camera. And there we go. So I'm just trying to get that color into place, well merged with the area around her dress and the neck. Just trying to cover that black clay so it's not visible. A little bit more. There we go. And now we are going to make an indent in the middle and lift both sides of the color. Again, getting that sort of 3D effect so it looks layered. Just like that. And now we're actually going to move on to the face. So for this, we're going to need 1.5 tablespoons of clay, again in that skin color we chose. We're going to knead this thoroughly, and very thoroughly, because it needs to be smooth. We want the area for her face to be really smooth and without any tears or cracks. Once that's done, we're going to stretch it a bit so it's more like an oval shape rather than a circle. And then I just flatten it a bit, and now we're going to start giving it that face shape. So you notice I'm making it angled at the bottom to make that chin. And I'm using this cutout from my template as a reference again. You can also just do this from scratch. The template just makes it a bit easier to follow along and get a similar result every time you make one, if you intend to make multiple of these. So I'm going to place that cutout on top of that shape, that little face, and I'm going to add the lines for the sides of her lips, and very lightly the top and bottom lip lines, the nose, and the area around her eyes, as well as the eyebrows. Again, very lightly, as you can see it here, just to get a reference of where these areas are going to be. And now we're adding a little bit of Vaseline, because we don't want our clay to dry out if in case we take longer in adding these details. So again, just adding the sides of her lips in there, and now using the rubber brush to make that lower lip stand out, making sure we can thin down the bottom and make that chin stand out as well, and adding the little chin dimple. And this is pretty much what I'm going to be doing, just adding the features to her face, making that smile or not smile line, because if you know, she doesn't smile that much. Again, properly highlighting that nose just to make sure we don't lose those lines, because sometimes while we're modeling the rest of the features, we might smudge out the others. So just making those lines in there, sculpting around like her cheeks, her jaw. And now I'm actually going to add that detail at the top between her nose and her lips. But to make sure this looks the way we need, I'm just going to add another small piece of clay. And for this, just adding a little bit of glue around the top lip. Getting the little bit of clay. And making a sort of like a drop shape, but it has to be thin on both sides, since it's going to act as the upper lip. And again, just making sure we shape that properly. Just like this. And again, making sure we're highlighting that philtrum. Again, that space between the nose and her upper lip, since it stands out a lot. Now we're going to give her lips a little bit of texture, just so they look a bit more natural, but then again, smoothing them down, because we don't want them to look like sort of scratched out. We just want to give it a little bit of texture. Just lowering the sides to get her expression right. And now it's going to look well blended together. Just like this. And now again, we're just going to follow again that line between her lips. And now it looks a little bit more natural. Now with this other tool, we're going to define that philtrum a bit more. Just like this. And now we are going to add her nose. So for this, again, we're going to need a little bit of glue. And I'm going to use a toothpick just to make sure I add just a little bit of glue. We can measure just to get a reference of how much clay we're going to need. So roughly 1/8 of a teaspoon, and then cutting that into 4 pieces. So one of those 4 pieces is what we're going to use to start shaping her nose. I'm making that drop shape just like this, placing it where we added the glue. But her nose has a little bit more volume, so I'm going to get another one of those 4 pieces, stretch it out, cut it in 4 pieces, and one of those I'm going to use it to add to the sides of her nose. So again, getting that drop shape, getting another one of those small pieces for the other side, like this. And then we're going to place each of these on one side just to get that basic shape for her nose. And now we're going to blend everything at the top. Because remember, the nose, it's going to blend into that, like the brows, so that top area of her eyes. So now for this part, we are going to need some water, because we're going to need to make sure it's well defined and well smoothed down. So we're going to start that at the top like this, and then slowly using our rubber brush, we're going to blend that into that, again, that top brow. Same thing for the other side. And the water just makes it easier to blend them together without leaving any strong lines. Now I'm just going to lift her nose a bit. Same for the sides, so the nostrils. And I'm going to start blending those nostrils into the main piece. So her nose bridge. Now underneath, I'm going to actually add in the nostrils. So making the indent and then pressing downwards to get this top clay to blend into the main face clay piece. And once again, just smoothing it down, slowly getting that shape of her nose better, like this. Again, I'm just trying to highlight those nostrils, lift the tip of her nose, and overall just sculpting very slowly to make sure we get a good shape, following again our reference images to get that shape we want, and trying to make her face look natural, so it doesn't look like we just glued a piece of clay on top. It looks like a single piece. Now the tip of her nose is very round, so again, this might be a little bit repetitive, but we're just trying to get that shape as close to the reference as possible. And we just keep doing that until we like how it looks. Again, you can notice that where we added that eye outline is almost completely blurred out, so I'm just adding some detail to make sure we can still see it when it comes time the time to work on her eyes. Again, highlighting that chin dimple, but always trying to smooth the lines we make. Adding a little bit more definition to her jaw. And refilling on water if we need to. I'm just trying to get all the area on this face as smooth as possible. I want to make sure that chin stands out, so I'm just pushing it forward a bit. Adding some detail for her cheeks, some definition to her cheeks. And defining that cheekbone a bit too. Always making sure we don't lose the definition on her chin. And now we're just going to mirror that on the other side. And always smoothing everything down so it doesn't look sharp. Unless, of course, we were going for a sharp feature or a sharp face. In this case, I'm just trying to make everything as smooth as possible. And again, going over that outline on her eye before we lose it completely. Now I like how this looks. I can work with this as a base. Now for this last step, we just need a little bit more water. One more smoothing down all over the face. And highlighting any details that maybe got a little bit too smooth. So that line between her lips, the texture on her lips as well. And now we have to let this dry. Once it's dry, it's going to look like this. And now we are going to highlight that side, those sides of her lips, like this. I'm going to make the area around her mouth stand out a bit more, making sure the nostrils look the way we want to. And now we can soften the sides a bit more since, again, our clay is still fresh. It can still be molded. We only let it dry enough for the water to evaporate or soak in. So I'm just making sure the features are sharper or more detailed stand out after all that work we just did. So I'm just going again through that, like her cheekbones, her chin. Now we are going to add shading, going back to those eyeshadows and using the same color we used on her neck. So I'm going to do this all around her face, on the edges, again for depth. Now I'm going to add some definition to her jawline, under her lip, around her chin. Adding some highlights to the mouth. and some to that, like the eye cavity. So this area that's a bit sunken down. Doing the same around her lips, sort of getting that expression, the frown. And on the cheekbone, adding a little bit more detail. So some contouring. And a little bit more on the sides of her lips. Just like this. Now I'm getting this sort of darker shade underneath her eyes, where her eyes will go. Just like this. And doing the same thing like over her eyes will be. On this stronger shade. Just like this. We're going to clean up this piece, this area a bit more. And always remember that to clean up, the best thing is to use towelettes. So I'm just removing everything around, and I can do this all over again. I just want to make sure this area is very clean so we don't have any smudges. And once that's fully dry, we're just gonna go over those same steps again. Remembering the specific shades we used. So again, we used this darker one under her eyes. And again, highlighting her cheekbones. Around the brows. Just like this. And her lips as well. And then blending that well. And I'm adding a little bit at the top of her forehead. And now we can move on to her eyes. Now for her eyes, since the clay is still fresh again, I'm just pressing down a bit on the area where her eye cavities would be, so you can get a better shape to work with. And always smoothing that down, making sure it's an even surface. And now we're going to get a bit of black eyeshadow. And I'm going to add a bit of detail under her eyes. Just like this. And doing that on both eyes. Now I'm just blending it out a bit so it looks like this. And now we're going to proceed on to paint her eyes. Now before we add the whites, we're just going to highlight the outline, so the top part and the bottom part of her eyes, again with the black eyeshadow. Blending that thoroughly, give her eye some depth. And now with our white acrylic paint, we can go in and make that eye shape. So sort of like an almond. Trying to make it sort of even. They don't have to be completely similar. Just like this. We're going to let that dry and then give it another coat. Once that's dry, we're going to go back in with the black eyeshadow, so underneath her eyes. Trying to make that even on both sides. And now we can proceed on to adding her pupils. Now this paint needs to be a bit more watered down, but not too much that it's difficult to control. Just enough so the brush glides easily while we're drawing. So we're making her facing upwards. Just like this. So we're just gonna add that sort of a half circle on the top of her eye, instead of what we will usually do, which is a full circle inside her eye. Now I'm just doing that same thing on the other eye. And try and keep them as even as possible, but again, not identical. Gonna make this one a little bit bigger. Now, same for the other one. Once we have this ready, I'm going to use again that same acrylic paint and go all around her eye. So in this case, I'm going up the top part first. All the way to the outside edge. Now for this part, I need the paint to be even more watered down. And on the bottom eyelid, I'm going to sort of make her eyelashes, but very softly. You can barely see them, just enough so it just looks more like a dotted line. Now for the top eyelid, we are going to go and make faux lashes now. Keeping them very close together. But not too long. Just like this. If you notice that the eye looks a bit more flatter, sorry, then just make it a bit more round again. And now we're just going to repeat these steps on the other eye. So outlining the top eyelid, adding the eyelashes, just like this, and just making sure we repeat the same steps. Now to highlight her bottom eyelid, I'm getting this peach color and just adding a line underneath that eye. We need the paint to be very watered down, so it's very soft, very subtle. And we're going to do the same thing for the other eye. Just like this. It's not that noticeable, but it's enough for the effect we're trying to get. I'm just going back in with my black paint to add some details. Trying to add some shading to the inside of her eyes. Now we are going to add the eyebrows. So I add these very softly to make it look like the actual eyebrow hairs. And since she's going to have her bangs covering most of her forehead, they're not going to be very noticeable. But we're just trying to make sure the layers look fine for when we start adding more things on top. From certain angles, you might be able to see them. And now doing the same for the other eyebrow. Now once we're done, we're going to add that little Y dot to her eye. Just like this. And now we're going to add a sort of red shade to her lips. I'm actually getting a coral color. Just watering that down a bit more. Just like this. And then going back in with a redder shade. And just adding that color to her lips. Outlining her lips. Just like this. Now we're just going to let that dry before we continue. And once it's dry, we're just going to go over those expression lines her nose all the way to the sides of her lips. Going back in on her chin, the sides of her mouth. So we can keep her expression as close as possible again. Now we're going to add another little white dot, more like a comma, to her eyes. Needs to be very, very delicate, very small, so just for that extra touch of shine. Same for the other eye, just like this. So her eyes stand out a little bit more. Now I'm extending her eyebrows just a little bit towards the center. And now we're going to add the freckles. So I'm getting brown paint, but it's very watered down. And we're going to add a little bit of that sort of coral color to add a little bit more richness to the color we want. And keep it from looking sort of dull and gray. And now we're going to use the thinnest brush we have. And again, the freckles don't need to look the same. But just before we do that, I'm going to highlight the sides of her nose a little bit more before we go in and start adding freckles. And also going in on those expression lines. And now I can start adding those freckles. So just very lightly covering her nose, just trying to make sure they're not too big. But also I'm trying to make sure they're not all the same shape. Just like this. Adding more to her nose bridge. And doing the same thing on the other side. Trying to make sure we keep them very subtle. And I'm just gonna, there we go. So now we're going to add a little bit more shine to her eye. And for this, I'm going to be using a little bit of nail polish. That clear kind. To get that sort of, like, to make her eyes look watery. And adding that bit of shine. Now once that's all done, I'm adding a bit more depth to underneath her eyes. Now before we place the face over her neck, we're going to measure half of a teaspoon of black clay to make her braids. So I'm getting 1/2 of a teaspoon for each. I'm stretching that out, cutting it in 3 equal pieces. Trying to keep them the same size if possible. And I'm going to stretch these out to 9 centimeters. And we're going to do the same for the other 2. For reference, 9 centimeters is roughly 3.5 inches. Now I'm just going to put them together at the top, and then we're going to start making that braid, just like we make braids on real hair. So it might be a little loose while we work on it, but the only thing we need to do is add a little bit of pressure to make sure it gets tighter. And we're just going to do that all the way until the end. And once we're done, it's going to look like this. So on the top part, I'm going to make a slanted cut. And we still don't know how long we need to cut it until we place it on the piece. So I'm just going to add a little bit of texture all throughout the braid. So when we start adding that shading, it's going to make the hair strands stand out a little bit. We can use a white eyeshadow for shading or highlighting, but I'd rather use blue on black hair, and it has that pearled effect. But it's completely up to you which one you want to use. Now I'm getting clay in the same color as her face just to make the ears. So for her ears, I'm going to need 1/8 of a teaspoon. Cutting that in half and then half again, so we get 4 pieces. And one of these 4 pieces is going to be one of her ears. We're going to shape both of them into balls. And then we're going to make them, flatten them, and then make them into an oval. Now we're getting 1 teaspoon of black clay, kneading that thoroughly, and sort of shaping into a half moon or a C or a croissant. And then adding glue to the top of the back of her head, and then placing this half moon on it before we place everything back on our main clay piece on the mug. So now we can actually go in and add glue to the top of her neck and place the face onto our mug. Again, pressing down on her eyes. I had a little bit of glue on my fingers, so make sure your hands are very clean before we move on to this part. And we're just going to move this around and see if we need to add a little bit more texture or pieces underneath to get that 3D effect we're looking for. And just like we did for the hair we added to the back, I'm making a half moon to place on the bottom part on the back of her head to get this expression that I'm aiming for based on my reference pictures. And now we are going to start shading. So making sure her face stands out a bit more from the top. So like she's facing, like she's looking upwards, but she's facing down a bit. Now the braids are gonna go behind her head. So right where that half moon ends. And we're just gonna place each of them at a time. Since they go behind her ears, these have to go in first. They're not too close to her neck, so we're just gonna space them out a bit. And now we're gonna cut the excess of her braids. You can also leave them longer so they lay flat on the surfaces, or we can just cut them so they end right where the mug ends as well. Just like this. Once that's done, we can actually move on and add the ears. So I'm getting one of those pieces. They're not going to be very noticeable, so we're just going to add some basic definition to them, mostly focusing on the bottom of her ear. So her earlobes, moving them a bit forward and adding that definition in there, just like this. Placing the other one on the other side. And again, just adding some basic definition. And we're gonna shade them the same way we did for her face, so everything looks even. Now we're going to work on the other hair pieces we have from our printable, and for that we need 1 tablespoon of black clay. We're going to stretch out enough to feed both of those cutouts in, and then just cut around them. And then going from the center outwards in one smooth line to keep it as close to our cutout as possible. Once we have both pieces, they look sort of like little mustaches. And now we're just going to add some texture using our cutout as a guideline. So in this same direction, since her parting is slightly to the side, I'm sorry. It's facing to the sides, going to the sides, since she has a middle part and she has her braids. Now we can place this on top of her forehead, adding a little bit of glue just on her head, because the part that we added to the back of her head is still fresh. So I'm just gonna stretch out this piece while I add it to make sure it goes all the way back. But I just realized it needs a little bit more volume, so we're going to get another teaspoon of black clay, and we're going to make another half moon. So I'm lifting this piece, making that half moon so we get the volume we need, and adding it to the top of her head, just like this. And now we have the volume we need, so we can get that piece back on top of her head. Again, adding that texture one more time. And trying to make sure her hair looks like it's going backwards, behind her ear. So this is done just through the texture. With the piece we added to the top, we're also going to give it some texture and blend it into a single piece. So it looks like one cohesive piece, not two pieces just stacked on top of each other. And now we're going to get half a teaspoon of black clay. And we're going to place this one, again, making it into a half moon. And then placing it in front of the hair we already have. So these are like her bangs. And working on that texture, going again behind her ear, so going backwards. So they look like multiple layers of hair, but still one single cohesive piece. So adding those hair strands, just like this. And now I'm going to work on her bangs. So adding the hair strands or the texture, like it looks like it's going forward. So they're mostly just up to down, up to down. And I'm going to separate some hair strands, just like this. Since the hair sort of comes together at some points. And again, we're just mimicking the reference photos for her hairstyle. Now, with another small piece of black clay, I'm just going to stretch that out and make two small hair strands that are going to go on the sides. Just like this. So they look like they're sort of falling on the sides of her face over the ear. Now we can add the bangs right here. Again, adding that texture, sort of what we would call it, brushing her face. And then blending the pieces together and making sure that the direction that we add the texture in makes sense for the hairstyle. So the bangs are falling to the front. We make the texture to the front. And now I'm lifting it a bit so we don't cover her eyes too much. But I do want him to cover her eyes. So with the scissors, I'm just making those separate hair strands and then making them thinner at the ends, just like this. Doing the same thing on the other side. Cutting at an angle so we already get that shape we need. And it's gonna look like this. And remember, we're just trying to emulate a reference picture. I'm not trying to make it fully identical. Photorealism isn't quite my thing. I like the pieces to sort of look like they're made of clay, but close enough that you know what I'm referencing in the work. Now I'm going back into her hair, just making sure those small strands are sort of separate from her face. And now we're going to add the highlights to the rest of her hair as well. Using our blue eyeshadow again. This is just to make sure we can see the hair texture. Always making sure it's slightly separate from her face so we can get that natural look and it sort of resembles hair. Just like this, and I'm just going back in to give it some texture, blending it in. Just like this. Now we are going to get 1 teaspoon of skin color clay to make Thing. So if you know, Thing is a hand. So I'm getting that piece of clay, stretching it out into a cylinder shape, and then cutting it in half. We're gonna leave one of these pieces aside to make the fingers, and with these other 3 pieces, we're making the palm of the hand and the wrist, forming it into a ball, then sort of a drop, and it looks more like a jelly bean, like a very strange jelly bean. Since he is the right hand, we're going to sort of keep that in mind while we shape it. Adding an indent, so pressing down on the palm and sort of making the area or space for the knuckles, but more like focusing on the shape. So it's curved as it gets closer to the pinky. Now we're just going to add the lines. In my case, this sort of looks like an M, so I'm just getting a general idea and just sort of drafting it here. Smoothing down those lines, since this is only a reference. And now we're going to work on it on this side. So the top side of the palm. Now that other half of a teaspoon we have, sorry, 1/4 of a teaspoon, I'm cutting it in half, then cutting each half in 3 pieces. We're gonna combine 2 of those to make a thumb, and for the other fingers we're just gonna get 1 of those pieces. So for the thumb, we're gonna knead that thoroughly so it's very smooth and even. And now we're gonna shape it into a drop. just not pointy on one side. So more like, we're just getting those finger shapes. Now we're gonna do the same with the other ones. When we make fingers like this, they usually end up being roughly the same size. So I'm just going to stretch out each finger to see the size of each one of them, and then assign them to their specific places according to the sizes. See, this one looks thicker and a bit longer, so it can be the middle finger. The other one can be the index finger, and then we're just going to do the same thing for the other pieces. See, this is what I meant. They all roughly look the same size in the end. So I'm going to cut off a bit where needed so we can get those, like the size that's specific for each finger. In my case, I only needed to cut the pinky, so that looks good now. And now we're going to start adding the fingers into the hand itself. So I'm going to start with this piece that I'm actually turning into. Now I would place wrong because I was placing it where the index finger would be, but the pinky would go on the far right of the hand, so I'm just placing it where it should go now. Now we're just going to integrate the finger into the rest of the hand, just like this. Remember, we have the knuckles at the top of our palm, so we're gonna start shaping that, taking that into consideration, and also blending both pieces together, what we would call underneath, so on the actual palm of the hand. We don't need glue because the clay is so fresh, but so we can use water to blend everything together if it dried out. Now I'm just gonna give it some texture. Separating each finger, well, not separating the finger, but adding those lines so you have it right in the middle of your finger. And then adding the fingernail. In my case, I use these coffee straws to make the fingernails. So I just use that to make the semicircle, and then my other tools to make the lines on both sides of the nail. Remembering to add that texture also underneath the finger. And another one closer to the top. So it's 2 lines on each finger. Two joints. So the clay might be drying out a bit at this point, so we can add a little bit of water to make sure everything's blending properly. And same thing for the knuckles. To give them that bit of texture, I'm using the coffee straw, just like this. And now we're going to add the ring finger. I'm adding a little bit of water. So since this is a ring finger, it needs to be a little bit longer in this case. I'm gonna try to get that in place and then start blending it together on the underside of the fingers where they meet the palm. Just like this. Making sure we take into account that little area where the fingers sort of webbed together, and then blending them thoroughly at the top as well, adding the nail, and of course both lines to add the definition to the nail bed. Adding a bit more definition to the knuckles. And then just adding the texture at the top of the fingers. Remember, we're just going to do that all the way around. We're not going to see much of the hand underneath, but we are going to be able to notice the shape if we add these lines. Now we can move on to the middle finger. And again, if it's drying out at this point, you can just add a little bit of water. And making that middle finger a little bit longer than the ring finger. And then just blending or merging both pieces together on the underside of the finger. And I'm just using a little bit of water on the rubber brush to make it easier to blend or merge both pieces together. Defining those knuckles, the texture on the fingers, right where the joints are, and then making the nail for this finger as well. We're going to start adding or smoothing everything down until we're done, just to make it easier to continue working on adding the fingers. So for now, that's our focus, and we're just gonna get everything together, put everything together at the end. In this case, we're adding the index finger, making that one a little bit shorter than the middle finger. It's roughly the same size, the same length as the ring finger in this case. And then just, again, the same procedure. I just noticed I forgot to add the joint lines. So those lines where your fingers bend. But you can add them at any point, so I just added them in. In this case, for the index finger, the knuckle seems to be a little bit lower. So I'm just moving that. And again, same procedure for the nail bed. And for that space between each finger. Adding those lines where the fingers bend. Just like this. And now we have 4 fingers. Now we're going to add the thumb. Now for the thumb, we're just going to attach it underneath, well, not underneath, on the lower part of the palm. And if you notice, the thumb goes past what sticks out of your hand. It goes deeper into your palm. So this is why I'm placing it lower over there. Now in this case, we just have to be careful to make sure that it makes sense and it's well placed. If looking at it from both angles. So I'm using my hand as a reference for this one, just because it's easier to get any angle I need right now. And again, just blending everything together so it doesn't look like I just stacked the pieces together. I want it to look like a single piece at the end as much as possible. We don't need to worry about making this like completely smooth because our hands are textured, so that's okay. Now we're making this thumb a little bit thinner. Add the nail. Defining that knuckle. Just like this. And now adding those lines where the thumb bends. Just like this. Now we have thing. Well, the base for thing. And now we are going to start adding those details to make it truly become thing. I'm just spritzing a little bit of water so I can start defining those details better. So I'm pressing down on this side that's sort of protruding outwards, and then blending those knuckles better into the rest of the hand. So I'm doing this for each finger. Trying to make sure these knuckles stand out, and so you can sort of see the tendons in there. And again, just using that rubber brush to smooth everything down. Remembering to get that sort of like webbed shape between the fingers, so it's not just straight cutting off between them. They have to be round. And I'm working on it on this side now because thing is facing this way. But if you're trying to place it in a different position or a different angle, then you can focus more on the other side of the palm, the actual palm. Now I'm going to start adding the detail for the injury, so those scars thing has. So adding that line for the stitch at the top around the wrist. And then adding some dots at the top there of what would be the wrist, and then some more underneath that line we just make, just like this. And then we're going to smoothen them a bit so they don't stand out too much. Now I want them to be close together enough. And now we're adding another scar at the top right here, going all the way to the center of the hand, the top of the hand, and another one around the index finger. And again, just softening that a bit and making sure we don't lose the shape on the rest of the hand. Now there's another scar coming in from the outside of the hand and ending between the middle and ring fingers, like this. And we're gonna smooth these down as well, just like this. Smoothing everything else. Since thing is very expressive, so I'm trying to keep those fingers separate. And around the ring finger, it has another scar. So we're just adding that line there as well. It's close to where we added the lines where the finger bends. And thankfully, one of the ways you can get the best effect here is to actually cut the finger off and then just place it back where it will go. This is just for a bit of a dramatic effect. So if you need to, just add a little bit of water to glue it back in place, and you can see how the line looks there. Of course, you can just use the tools to actually make the line, but cutting it off will give it a different look. In this case, you notice this one keeps falling off while I'm working on it, so I'm adding a little bit of wire to make sure this doesn't happen at all, even after it dries. And now we can just slide the tip of the finger back in place, and it won't move anymore because it has the wire as a base and support. I'm just adding back some of that detail that we lost after cutting it and adding that wire in it. And then pushing those spaces between the fingers in a little bit more. And moving all the way into the tendons. Now we are going to need an extra piece of clay. This would go sort of closer to the wrist, and we're just going to blend this together. This is that joint that sometimes sticks out a bit. Just like this. Now we're going to let this dry. Once it's dry, we're going to start shading it. So I'm going to get that orange eyeshadow to give it that fleshy color and help all that detail we just added stand out. You can see we can now see the lines and everything's coming together quite nicely. And then just being careful not to lose the shape while we do this. We can also shade around the palm of the hand. In this case, since we're not going to need it that much, it's not going to be very noticeable, I'm not using too much eyeshadow on that. And added a bit of a stronger eyeshadow where the shadows would go. And where the skin might be a bit more pigmented. Now I'm going to get some black shadow around the fingernails. You notice, Thing moves around with its fingers, so they're naturally to get a little bit dirty. But since they're not, it's not like the nails are painted black, we're just gonna use our towelettes again to sort of take off some of that eyeshadow from the middle of the nail. And get that effect like it's sort of just stuck, the dirt is stuck on the outside or maybe even under the fingernail. Now for the wounds, those scars or wounds, the stitches, I'm going to get a orange color and run it all through those lines. Just like this. And we're going to do the same for this one. Going around the index finger. Like this. Same for the other one, coming from the outside of the hand towards the space between the middle and ring fingers and the one at the top right. And again for the one where we cut that finger off. And now we're also going to do this on the little stitches I made at the top around the wrist. And I want to make that stand out a bit more, so adding a bit more pressure. And now we're going to use some brown color, brown paint, mixing that in with a little bit of that orange paint and then going over those wounds like this. But again, same like we did before, we're trying to get that rich tone. So I'm mixing it with enough orange paint and going over all of the wounds. Just trying to accentuate this part right here. And now using black, I'm going to go back in and make the stitches on the wounds. Placing it here and then going across the wound. And then going all the way, even if it's sort of facing downwards, just adjusting our angle accordingly. And this paint, I am using it straight out of the bottle, so it's very thick, just to hopefully get some texture from the stitches or for the stitches. And just doing that for all of the ones. Now the one on the finger, on the ring finger, it's only one stitch, but it's also very subtle. So I watered down the paint, and I'm going to start highlighting the round part, of the nail, so the cuticle, with some of that black paint. And we're gonna let that dry. And once that's dry, we can go back in and shade with our orange eyeshadow just to soften those wounds down a bit and make them look like scars. Now we're going back in on that wound around the wrist with a toothpick and poking the holes we already made, so they're very noticeable, just like this. Now we're going to add one more piece in the same color, just to get the effect I'm looking for. So I flattened this piece and I made it the same diameter as the top of the wrist, adding some glue and then sort of adding indents all around this piece to make it look like it's facing inwards or going inwards, like it's perforated by the stitches. And then with 1/8 of a teaspoon of black clay, I'm gonna stretch it out and cut it into 4 pieces, and we're only gonna use one of those 4 pieces. Now we're going to stretch this out as thin as we can. If it breaks, it's fine. We're just gonna need a little piece, so just keep working on one of those pieces, just like this. I just realized I almost missed adding some shading to that extra piece we added to the top. And after adding the shading, I'm gonna start adding those stitches using these pieces of clay. So going from the hole at the bottom to the hole at the top. And then just using either a toothpick or a round tool to go into that space and make sure it stays in place. Just like this. And we go back in and add the texture at the top. So it totally looks like a stitch, like it's going into the skin. Going into that next one, all the way to the top. And we're going to do the same thing all around the wrist. Once we're done, it's going to look like this. And we're going to go back in and add some shading. Getting that black eyeshadow back in there. And now back with the orange eyeshadow. Going to go around the top of the wrist, just like this. And anywhere that needs some extra detail. And now thing is ready. We can use it like this and place it on top of a spoon to pair with the mug. In my case, I'm going to place it on her shoulder. Since the braids, as you notice, are not glued into the rest of the piece, I can just lift them, shape thing a bit so it can wrap around the shoulder, and then just pose it in place. Now to make it very clear that it's wrapped around the shoulder, just shaping it a bit better, just like this, and then just placing it over Wednesday's shoulder, just like this. Now I just have to add a little bit of glue underneath the hand to glue it in place. So I'm just adding it on the palm of the hand so it can stay in place. I just checked in with my daughter to make sure that she liked this placing because she loved the show, and she's actually the reason why I'm making this mug, because I'm making it for her. So going back into those fingers and just making sure they kept their shape. And now once we like it, we're basically done. Now we have our Wednesday mug accompanied by Thing. I really like making this project, so I also hope you enjoyed it as well. Again, my name is Rossy Rivera, and thank you for joining us. Many blessings.